Good morning, everyone. Welcome to track one of the digital engineering track. Today, we have the pleasure of having our first group of presenters. We have Mr. Tom McDermott, who is the Deputy Director and CTO at SERC at Stevens Institute of Technology. Joining him today is Ms. Caitlin Henderson. Caitlin is a fifth-year PhD candidate at Virginia Tech in the Department of Industrial and Systems Engineering. They will be presenting updates on SERC Research Task WRT-1040, Application of Digital Engineering Measures. With that, I turn it over to you both.
Thank you, Jan. So this project on digital engineering measures has gone on for some time now. It's actually quite interesting when we landed in this space with the central question of, can we quantitatively measure the benefits of model-based system engineering and digital engineering in order to understand the return on investment in the space? And so we thought that would be an easy problem to solve. What we found was effectively nobody was doing it yet. And so we were starting from scratch in this area. And so I'll talk to some of the history first, and then we'll talk to you what we've done on this particular project. Caitlin Henderson is a PhD student at Virginia Tech, and so much of this work is work she's done, and so she'll cover part of this briefing. So in this particular task, we were focusing on developing causal measurement models of potential quantitative metrics to measure digital engineering in that space. And so the bulk of the presentation will be on that. The measurement plan is leaning towards a measurement specification, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then finally, we wanted to characterize a couple of organizations and projects so we could validate the model. And I'll show you one example of that we did at the end here. So we'll talk to the motivation, previous work, the causal model, the actual measurement framework, and then one slide on validation efforts. So we're all about digital transformation in that space. And digital transformation, we want to address and integrate across all business processes having to do with engineering and related functional disciplines. So model-based system engineering, in particular a digital system model, is a way to manage collaboration across engineering disciplines and other stakeholders, and as part of that. And so, we want to capture this central system model, but we don't have any quantitative evidence of the value at this point. Almost all of the evidence is qualitative in that domain. And so as a measurement discipline, it's something that has to evolve. Now, models are software. And so we do have a lot of evidence on quantitative measures from software, so we can build on that as we go along. So I'll mention the previous work. There's on the SERC website, you can access these reports, but we have a literature review that Caitlin did. We have a benchmark survey where we went out to the community, and then we had the initial DE metric study that identified lots of candidate metrics. And so you can read these full reports on your own if you're interested in them. Just to summarize, so the literature review, it reviewed some 360 pieces of literature that talked about the benefits of model-based system engineering. And out of those documents, almost all of those were perceived measures. Only 2 examples that we were able to find at that point in time actually had quantitative evidence in them. But we were able to go through all those perceived measures and categorize those benefits into 48 types in that space. And so that report documents all 48 types. What we found based on the survey and the literature review was some of those things showed up a whole lot more in the discussion. And so we have the top-sided, which is the baseline for measurement that we took into this space. And so you can see what those are here. In conjunction with that, we did the benchmark survey. The survey actually had 2 sets of questions, one of them talking to the benefits of MBSE, but the other questions talking to the enablers and obstacles to adoption of MBSE. And so in addition to that, the survey identified 37 factors that were found to be enablers and or obstacles in this space. And so these are some of the top enablers and obstacles. One thing that you'll see here is that there's a lot of overlap. So leadership support is a huge enabler to transition, but it also is an obstacle if it's not there in the space. So that's the history of the space. The previous report on the DE metric study identified 55 of those factors that would be potential metrics across these 5 categories in the space. And so we have quality metrics, we have metrics that have to do with velocity or agility. We have user experience metrics, which are highly related to adoption in the space. We have a unique set of metrics that are fairly unique. I'll talk to this later on, related to knowledge transfer, which is enabled by the models. And then we have these top adoption metrics. And so what we were able to do is we were able to take this study and then use it to feed into the causal model. In the process, we now have a metrics working group that is a cross-industry working group with AIA, NDIA, and COSI, and the PSM group. And so we're formalizing these metrics into a specification. And that specification is going to be based on the practical software measurement methodology, and it's going to be a government industry consensus standard that gets published towards the end of this year. So we've been both using this working group as part of our validation and also supporting this working group in terms of providing specifications and support. So at this point in time, I will turn it over to Caitlin, and she can talk to the causal model. And Caitlin, just let me know when to switch slides.
Thanks, Tom. So since there are such a large number of potential metrics and we found very few metrics that were actually being used, we wanted to narrow down which metrics would be the most impactful to initially measure. And with the precedents in the performance measurement literature, we decided to develop a causal map to see how the potential metrics relate to each other and see where are the key parts of this process. So for the nodes in this causal model, we started with the expected benefits from the literature review. And we found that there were some parts that were missing. So we ended up adding some of the adoption enabling factors from the survey results. So Tom, if you could go to the next slide and talk a little bit about the actual causal model. So this was our first iteration. You could see these green benefits at the top are what we refer to as the direct benefits. And these are essentially benefits that we thought were kind of the direct result of the implementation of MBSE. So an improved capability or feature, these benefits directly stem from those. And the rest of them are more secondary benefits that originate from these 8 direct benefits. So click on the next one. So this is the second iteration, which we added the adoption factors, which are in blue here. And the biggest change between these two is that it created a causal loop. So the benefits lead to secondary benefits, which are demonstrated results for leadership to see. So when they see these results, they should be more willing to invest, which will improve the tools and the infrastructure and the methods, which should also, going forward, increase the benefits. And click on the next one. This is the final version. You can see that it's pretty complicated. So one of the ways that we tackled this was looking at the causal model in terms of one specific direct benefit and looking at all of the causal links that stemmed from that. So if you click on the next slide, Tom, this is one example of how we kind of were able to analyze and comprehend this causal model, and it's also how we presented it to the Digital Engineering Metrics Working Group to provide validation for us. We can go to the next slide. The first analysis that we did to try and understand which nodes and benefits are the most important was a visual analysis using the technique like I was just talking about, with going through each individual direct benefits. So this picture up here is an example of the automation chain of benefits. So the nodes that we found were most important are listed here. And we actually, as we are going through them, you can see that there are some that were present in almost all of the different maps. So you go to the next slide, please. So this is our more quantitative analysis. So these two measures on the left are different centrality metrics, and you can see it might be a little hard to tell which are the maroon versus the black ones. But most of these up here are in maroon text. Those are also ones that we found in our visual analysis previously. So there's quite a big overlap between what we had seen visually and these calculated measures. So we go to the next slide, please. So given our different analyses, the following on the slide are the top metric candidates that we are proposing that would be the most impactful to measure sooner rather than later. And this depiction of the map has the maroon links and nodes are what is represented by the metric candidates here, which does cover a good deal of the whole causal chain.
Okay, so at this point, so trying to back out of the causal model, this is just kind of a simple map that discusses some of the work that we've been doing to extend this out and transition it to the community. So if we look at one of these top level measures, better accessibility of information, you can see that there's a measurement flow that has to be initiated in an organization in order to understand the benefits of this type of activity. And so it starts with a couple of enablers that would be adoption measures. And so tools, methods, and processes would address the maturity of your infrastructure. A taxonomy, ontology, or libraries would be assessing the development of the authoritative source of truth. That would be where all of your data and models are stored. And so you would then be accessing that authoritative source of truth through these tools, methods, and processes. And so that feeds into the better accessibility. Now, the outcome of that has a measurement set of factors associated with it in that space. And so one of those is a leading indicator, which is actually just measuring the number of people willing to use the tool. So you have to actually track how many people are working into and out of that source of truth versus not in the space. That leads us then to the primary causal benefit metric, which is associated with change management or change control. So we ought to be able to see that it's easier in terms of effort and time to make changes. And that would then feed into a metric specification. In fact, reducing effort and reducing time would be specifications in that space. And so the specifications that mostly affect these are actually resolution of defects and rework that lead to time in the space. And then your long-term outcome, your related outcome metric, is overall reduce cost and reduce schedule. And so the benefit of this causal map is that we can now link these things together and understand how an enterprise has to build a measurement plan for each one of these factors. And so this one's in the information category of process performance or process efficiency as we relate it to the specification. So we're able to take that back to the working group. And so the working group is using this PSM measurement framework to do that. And the start of PSM is actually to build a table that's called an ICM table, information category and measure. And so you can see then that we have these information categories that feed to a concept that we would measure, that then feed to potential measures. And these are determined by questions in that space. And so what we're able to do is we're able to take all of these different causal measures in our causal map, and using the subject matter expertise and the working group, we were able to settle in on a reasonably sized table of things to put into this measurement spec as we go forward. And so that's been going on for some time now as we transition this work into the space. Now, in order to do that, we had to build the front matter for this specification, which is actually a measurement framework. And so the PSM metric then, it counsels us before we finalize our measurement plan to decompose the work that you have to do in digital engineering, because what you want to do is measure the work. And so we built this DE Work Decomposition Framework, which was agreed upon by the working group, that has these components. It starts with your digital infrastructure, your data models and supporting tools. Because digital engineering and model-based system engineering, it supports a system engineering process and life cycle, then there are things associated with the life cycle model that you choose. That feeds into a set of process models that then feeds into this authoritative source of truth, which is built on a system, data, and model ontology. And finally, at the top, then you get to models, data and models. And there's actually three types. And so you have operational data and models, which is the stakeholders view. And you have discipline-specific data and models, which is the engineer's view. And then you have system data and models in the middle. And so the primary purpose of model-based system engineering is to build this system model that links all the other models and data together in the space. And so we are measuring that specifically. So the PSM framework, which is focused on these information products, guided the development up front, information to measures in terms of questions. We actually took that into another framework called Goal Question Metric, which is a more standard framework in the software community for developing metrics. You identify a goal, a set of questions, and then the measures to make them space. And so the next step in the process after we did the causal analysis was to map out the landscape. And so this is a diagram, node and link diagram that kind of lists all the questions and all the potential metrics that are being worked right now in the space. I'll point out a couple of things in here. And so you can see in the DE metrics category, we have our work framework. So we have lifecycle models and process models, digital infrastructure, ontology, data, and models in the space. And then we have another set of factors that are core factors in the measurement scheme. One of these is phase. And so, digital engineering, model-based system engineering has an upfront job to define the system architecture, and the system design at a high level before the actual product is built. And so there's a transition through sets of phases that lead to the actual product delivery in the space. And so a big benefit of model-based system engineering and digital engineering is to actually improve the process from phase to phase. And so we need to measure by phase. The other concept which I mentioned is that you have these system models. And so we're actually trying to track the effective performance of building system models as the connector to all of the other components of the engineering process. There's kind of three base measures, as we call them, that are important in the domain. And so one of those is defects. So are we discovering defects and working them off within phase in a more timely fashion, which leads to reduced time, increased quality, and reduce effort. Effort is the second base metric, and so can we actually measure that effort? And then the third base metric is actually model elements. So as we define our world in models and data, then we're representing the system as a set of model elements. And so there's ideas about size of that, completeness of that, other things that are associated with it. And model element remains a kind of a general term that's specific to tools. So the next step for us was to go back and then map all of these metrics as a validation into this goal question metrics framework. And so just back to our original example of accessibility of information that we showed you, you can see that the authoritative source of truth feeds into, with discipline-specific models and system models, two questions. How effectively can we access and share information across disciplines? And how effectively can we access and share information across stakeholders? And so there's a set of potential metrics that are being put into the specification for these things. And so representing that in the GQM framework, you can see how those two questions are then linked to metrics. The full model, the full map, if you want to call it that, and causal model tells us that it's not just this independently. There's another question which has to do with the accessibility of information for everybody involved in the system in that space. And so that accessibility has its own set of questions and metrics, which is why number of people using models becomes a leading indicator for accessibility of information, whereas these other measures becomes a more lagging indicator in that space. And so now we're able to go back and link leading indicators to long-term indicators. So we have these for each one. I'm not going to go through the details of all of these things, but you can kind of see effort, rework, and ease of making changes is the second important factor. There's a set of questions and metrics associated with that. Reviews, peer reviews or formal reviews, and associated defects tracking is a third important category of metrics. And so there's a set of defined measures for that. And then there's others that I won't go into in this map for sake of time. So in our maturation process now, we're able to go off and start using this causal model associated with what we've determined to be the primary measurements. So I don't have a slide on this right now, but the DE metrics working group is writing an initial set of specifications. And the plan is to release that initial set around the end of this year out of the working group. It will be released with the practical software measurement format on their website, psm.org, but it'll also be published by the International Council of Systems Engineers and the NDIA and also the AIA. And so we'll have our first kind of community definition to guide people's metrics in this space. So we've done a couple of validation efforts on paper, and we're doing some other validation efforts as we go along to finish up the project. And so because digital engineering and model-based system engineering is linked to the system engineering process, it was useful to go back to the initial published metric specification, which is the INCOSE, PSM, and MIT System Engineering Leading Indicators Guide, and see whether we're supporting that in the space. We also have, one study that in literature that's a really effective study looking at the measurement, and that's this Navy SWIFTest program. We'll talk about that as we go forward. So just showing you in terms of a map, the link between digital and model-based system engineering to the overall efforts in system engineering. You can see that in purple here, we have the system engineering measurement guide, the leading indicators that they recommend we track. And in the green, we have the digital engineering measures that we've identified. And so one of the nice validations of this is that we're able to actually take the system engineering leading indicators, which were honestly very difficult to measure in a document-based view of the world. So as we move to digital, we can more directly measure. And I think one of the issues with adoption of these system engineering measures has been the difficulty of actually collecting data on the measurement. So now we can go back and link and say, for something like work approval trends, we can go back and we can directly measure the approvals in a digital space, in that space, or action closure, defect error trends. We can measure these defects in the space. And so one of the nice things about this as we move forward into digital engineering is we're going to have a nice digital data-driven measurement collection of our system engineering processes, which I think will help with the adoption. So those are leading indicators to DE matrix, and some of these things are associated with the framework itself, but the measurement would be focused into a different area in the space. Second validation was this SWIFTest program. This is kind of interesting because they actually looked at the evolution of software baselines across these 6 Navy platforms over time. And at one baseline, they had just a requirements digitalization using doors. And then at another baseline, then they actually moved into their MBSE initiative. And they were able to show quantitatively a return, a set of benefits based on using MBSE. Now, they were primarily monitoring the requirements development process between the government and contractor in the space. But one of the nice things is now is we had a documented case study, we were able to go back and we were able to do an initial causal model validation against the reported results of this program. So this is just showing the map in that space. And so it turned out that their experience and their reported measures did actually follow our causal model. So now we have an N1 in terms of causal validation. And so ideally we'll be keep tracking this into the future. So just in terms of the last slide here, and we'll open it up for any questions that you might have. So we have a set of program office discussions. We're working with a couple program offices to help them in process develop a measurement plan in that space. There are very few programs right now that are actually trying to quantify the digital engineering component, but in terms of process, in almost all cases, the digital engineering measures are then linked to other release measures, particularly software releases in the space. And so in our final report, we'll be able to talk to that, but there's very limited activity going on in the community. Yeah, we hope with the specification there'll be growth in that space. The other thing we're wrapping up doing is a survey of DE and MBSE tools. So what can you measure in the tools today? Obviously, if you're familiar with SysML and model-based system engineering tools, almost all of those tools have model validation capabilities that are focused on this metric of increased traceability. And so you can measure traceability areas, but we're also looking at things like functional completion. You'll also know, if you're familiar with the tools, that there's not any capability in any MBSE tools right now to measure and track defects, but many of them are integrated with other tools like Windchill that do defects tracking over time and configuration management. So we'll finish up with this tool capability survey. And then this work will transition into, as experienced, into the SE modernization program, which is going to be the subject of the panel that I'm chairing later on. So at this point, I think we have 5 minutes for questions, if anybody wants to come back and ask any questions. So I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, the only question was from Alfred, asking if the work is published anywhere besides the PowerPoint. So I pointed him to your page. You can find the project at serc.org. and it's all listed there, all the publications.
Yeah, so all the previous work is published, and we're wrapping up this phase. So the report on this particular set of activities, the causal model, will be published at the end of this month, at the end of November or early December in the space. And then we'll move on to the next phase of this. So there'll be another report. Also, Caitlin authored a paper at the American Society for Engineering Management last week that discusses directly the causal model in the space. So we do have, if you want to send an email to myself or Caitlin, we can send you a paper on the causal model itself in that space. And then the actual DE metric specification, again, that activity is hoping to put out an initial specification draft for comment before the end of the year. So if you're interested in this area, stay tuned with us. We've got a lot of work still to do.
To Tom and Caitlin for your interesting presentation. We really appreciate it.